She told me I should learn to live less comfortably right in the middle of her perfect 40-year anniversary party. I smiled, raised my cheap wine, and sent a single email that froze every asset her family survived on. By the time the valet brought their car around, their credit cards were dead. They wanted me to live with less, so I made sure they would have nothing at all. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old, and I was sitting at table 19, the one closest to the kitchen service door, at the 40th wedding anniversary party of my future in-laws. The air conditioning at the Cypress Point Golf Club was working overtime to combat the heavy Georgia humidity, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the distinct, metallic tang of desperation, masked by luxury. The Pikes certainly knew how to throw a party. A 5-piece jazz band was playing something upbeat in the corner, drowning out the clinking of crystal. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated with silver trays, piled high with oysters and champagne, moving like silent ghosts between the guests. Everyone here looked like they had stepped out of a magazine, dripping in diamonds and silk. And then there was me. I was wearing my navy blue Sunday dress, the one I bought off the rack at a department store 3 years ago, and my sensible orthopedic shoes. I looked exactly like what they thought I was, a quiet, irrelevant widow living on a fixed income, completely out of place in their glittering world. Lydia Pike glided toward my table like a shark, scenting blood in the water. She was wearing an emerald necklace that probably cost more than the market value of my first house. Her eyes flicked down to the handbag resting on my lap, noting the worn leather handles, and then to my phone with its spiderweb crack across the screen. She smiled, but the expression did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Eleanor." "Darling," Lydia purred, swirling her Chardonnay. "I was just telling the girls how quaint it is that you are still driving that old Subaru. You know, we were talking about the wedding expenses and the down payment for the kids." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough to be heard by everyone at the table. "People your age really should learn to live less comfortably," she said, tapping her manicured fingernail against the rim of her glass. "Stop spending on yourself. Stop holding on to things. If you lived with a little less, you could actually support the younger generation, like your Daniel and my Savannah." Before I could respond, Savannah appeared at her mother's elbow. My future daughter-in-law looked radiant and terrifyingly similar to her mother. She giggled, covering her mouth with a hand that sported a diamond ring my son had gone into significant debt to buy. "Oh, Mom, stop teasing her," Savannah said, though her eyes were hard and amused. "But seriously, Eleanor, my friend's grandmother sold her house and her car to help them buy a condo at the Palms. It is just what family does these days. We have to make sacrifices to help the kids get ahead." I kept my expression perfectly bland. I nodded slowly, looking like the obedient, chastised poor relation. Inside, however, I was laughing. They judged me by my shoes. They judged me by my car. They had absolutely no idea that the name Brooks was not just the name of a groom who engineered bridges. It was the name on the founding charter of Viridian State Trust. It was the name on the majority of the bank shares. And, most importantly, it was the name that ultimately controlled the massive, suffocating debt that Pike family enterprises had been rolling over for a decade. Lydia gave me one last pitying pat on the shoulder and turned away to toast with her friends. "To living well," she shrieked, clinking glasses with a woman in a red sequined dress. I picked up my cracked phone. I did not open the camera to take a picture of the festivities. I opened my email application. The draft was already there, sitting in the outbox, waiting for a single touch. The subject line read, "Activation of Credit Limit Restriction Clause, Pike Group." The body of the email was exactly 2 sentences long. It was a direct instruction to the Chief Risk Officer, who I knew was currently sitting at his desk working late, to immediately freeze all unsecured credit lines associated with the Pike family due to material adverse changes in their risk profile. I pressed send. It was such a small motion. No fireworks went off. The jazz band did not stop playing. The waiters did not drop their trays. But in the invisible world of digital finance, I had just detonated a nuclear bomb. I looked across the room to the open bar. Franklin Pike, the father of the bride, was laughing loudly, his face flushed with bourbon. He pulled out his platinum corporate card and waved it at the bartender to cover a tab that was likely several $1,000s. He looked like a king in his castle. He had no idea that in the server room of a bank downtown, red flags were starting to pop up on every single account he owned. The system was processing my command. The rejection was coming. To look at me 6 months ago, you would have seen nothing but a ghost of a woman fading into the humid backdrop of the Georgia suburbs. I lived alone in a modest 2-story wooden house with peeling white paint, surrounded by overgrown hydrangeas that I tended to with obsessive care. I drove a 10-year-old Subaru that rattled violently whenever the speedometer climbed above 40 miles per hour. To my neighbours, I was just Eleanor, the quiet widow surviving on her late husband's small pension, probably counting pennies to pay the electric bill. They would bring me leftover casseroles with pity in their eyes, never suspecting that the woman accepting their charity in a faded cardigan could buy their entire subdivision with the quarterly dividends from a single investment portfolio. They did not know the history. They did not know that before I was a widow, I was the chief accountant of Viridian State Trust. My husband, Arthur, was the handshake and the smile of the bank, but I was the brain and the blade. Together, we built the credit assessment system that fueled half the small businesses in this state. When Arthur died of a sudden stroke 5 years ago, I withdrew from the public eye. I let the board believe I was a grieving, overwhelmed old woman. I resigned from the executive team, but I kept 51% of the voting stock. I became a silent ghost in the machine, an unofficial advisor to the current director, watching every move from the shadows. My life became a performance of calculated mediocrity. By day, I clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and argued about the price of eggs at the supermarket. I baked lemon cakes for the church charity drive and knitted scarves for the homeless shelter. It was a comfortable disguise, a warm blanket of irrelevance. But by night, the routine shifted. Once the curtains were drawn, I would pour a glass of single malt scotch, my one private luxury, and log into the bank's secure server. I did not read romance novels. I read credit reports. I analysed balance sheets, liquidity ratios, and debt service coverage as a way to relax. It was my way of keeping Arthur alive, guarding the fortress we had built. Then came the Tuesday that changed the texture of my silence. My son, Daniel, sat at my scarred oak kitchen table. He is 34 years old, a civil engineer with honest eyes and a spirit that is far too gentle for the century he was born into. He has always believed the lie of my poverty. He looks at my old furniture and feels a crushing guilt that he cannot afford to buy me a palace. "Mom, I met someone," Daniel said, his voice laced with a nervousness that made him look like a teenager again. "Her name is Savannah? Savannah Pike." The name landed between us like a dead bird. Pike. In this part of Georgia, The Pike name was synonymous with flashy real estate developments and a kind of loud, aggressive wealth that demanded attention. Pike, I asked, keeping my voice steady as I poured him more coffee. As in the family that built the Magnolia Crest shopping centre. Yes, Daniel said, a blush creeping up his neck. She is amazing. Mom, she works in marketing. Well, she is sort of an influencer part-time. But she is really smart. She makes me feel like I can be huge, like I am not just a guy who pours concrete for a living. I smiled the smile of a supportive mother, but the auditor in my brain was already flagging the transaction. I am happy for you. Honey, I said, patting his hand. She sounds vibrant. Later that night, the bank ledgers remained closed. Instead, I opened a new tab on my laptop and typed in her name, Savannah Pike. Her life unspooled across the screen in a series of high-definition squares. There were photos of brunch in Paris, yacht parties in Miami, and endless shots of designer handbags arranged like art pieces. There was no evidence of a 9-to-5 job. The only text accompanying these images were vague, breathless hashtags about partnerships and brand collabs that seemed to generate more envy than income. I stared at a photo of her holding a glass of champagne, laughing with her mouth wide open. She looked expensive. She looked like a liability. He has the right to make a mistake. I whispered to the empty room, the silence of the house pressing in on me. My job is to prepare the safety net, or the knife. I closed the laptop and turned off the lamp, sitting in the darkness for a long moment. I did not pull the Pike family credit file that night. But for the first time, the thought crossed my mind. The connection had been made. The risk assessment had begun. The first time I met Savannah, we went to a seafood restaurant on River Street that charged $30 for an appetizer. Savannah spent the first 20 minutes of the meal arranging the grilled oysters to get the perfect lighting for a photograph. She did not eat a single one until she had posted the image to 3 different social media platforms. When she finally put her phone down, she did not ask me about my life, my late husband, or my interests. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide with a concern that felt entirely rehearsed. So, Eleanor, she began, taking a small sip of her cocktail. Daniel tells me you have retired. Have you thought about your financial plan for the later years? Long-term care is just so expensive these days. I blinked, momentarily taken aback by her audacity. She was effectively asking if I had enough money to avoid becoming a burden on her future. Oh, I manage? I said, looking down at my napkin and deliberately slumping my shoulders to look smaller. The pension isn't much, but I use double coupons at the grocery store. I make do? Savannah nodded slowly, a look of pity mixed with calculation crossing her face. That is brave, she said. But honestly, our generation has to carry so much student debt and housing costs. It really helps when the older generation realizes they need to live a little less comfortably. You know, to not be a burden later. Everyone has to tighten their belts. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes saying clearly, she is sweet, but she is going to be expensive. My second encounter with the Pikes took place 2 weeks later at their residence in a gated community named Magnolia Crest Estates. The house was a monstrosity of faux Tuscan columns and oversized windows that screamed for attention. Lydia Pike opened the heavy oak door. She was a woman who had been fighting the aging process with a scalpel and was currently winning a temporary truce. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my polyester slacks and my sensible shoes. Welcome. Eleanor, she said, her smile tight. Daniel, why don't you let Savannah show you the wine cellar and the infinity pool? The tour takes a while. Once the children were gone, Lydia led me into a living room that looked more like a furniture showroom than a home. She poured me a glass of wine that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. It is exhausting. Isn't it? Lydia sighed, sinking into a velvet armchair, raising children who just refuse to settle. My Savannah is used to a certain standard, and frankly, Eleanor, the burden falls on us parents. She took a long drink and fixed me with a hard stare. You know, people of our generation, we sit on these assets, houses, savings accounts. It is a bit selfish, don't you think? If we liquidated some of that, the children could afford these modern condos. They can't take off because we are holding on to the runway. We really should learn to live with less, so they can have more. Before I could answer, Franklin Pike burst into the room. He was a large man who took up too much space and spoke too loudly. He opened a climate-controlled cabinet in the corner. Look at this beauty, Franklin boomed, holding up a bottle. Got a case coming from Napa. Shame I have to fight tooth and nail to get the liquidity for it. These local banks, they are absolute dinosaurs. He poured himself a drink, his face flushing red. I have got a redevelopment project that is going to double the value of the waterfront. And some bean counter at the bank is harassing me about proof of cash flow. Can you believe that they don't understand that a name like Pike is its own collateral? They need to be flexible with families of our standing. I sat perfectly still, holding my wine glass with both hands. I listened as he complained about the revolving credit line that was currently covering their mortgage, their car leases, and apparently, this wine. Banks are just obstacles. Franklin scoffed. They exist to serve visionaries like us. I took a small sip of wine. It was excellent. That sounds frustrating, I said softly. When someone is drunk on their own arrogance, recounting debts they believe to be assets, a banker like me does not see power. I only see a noose that is slowly, inevitably tightening. That evening, I drove home in silence. The hum of the Subaru's engine the only sound in the dark. As soon as I walked through the door, I did not go to bed. I went straight to my study, a small room lined with bookshelves that smelled of old paper and dust. I fired up my laptop and logged into the Viridian State Trust's secure internal server. I did not need a password manager. The access codes were burned into my memory alongside my wedding date and my social security number. I felt like a detective dusting for fingerprints. Only my crime scene was a spreadsheet and my magnifying glass was a pivot table. I typed in the search terms, Pike, Magnolia Crest Holdings, and Pike Family Enterprises, LLC. The screen filled with data, cascading down in columns of red and black. It was worse than I thought. It was a financial house of cards held together by saliva and blind optimism. Franklin's real estate empire was not built on owned assets. It was built on revolving credit lines. I saw cross-collateralization that made my head spin. His house secured the business loan. The business loan secured the vacation home, and the vacation home seemed to secure a yacht that I was fairly certain he had already sold. Their actual cash flow was anemic. A trickle of water trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Then, I found the smoking gun. I was scrolling through the liability structure of their largest loan, a massive line of credit that kept their construction projects from stalling when I saw the guarantor. It was a legacy clause, a remnant of a founder's protection pool my late husband Arthur had set up 20 years ago to encourage local development. The primary guarantor for the Pike family's liquidity wasn't Franklin. It was a silent shareholder block. It was me. I sat back, stunned. I had been personally, albeit indirectly, underwriting the champagne I watched them drink 3 hours ago, and the limit was nearly maxed out. They were 98% utilized. I dug deeper into the correspondence folder attached to the file. I found a scanned PDF of an email Franklin Pike had sent to our former credit manager 6 months ago. My heart went cold as I read the highlighted text. Don't worry about the collateral requirements. Franklin had written, the guarantor structure is solid. That old woman, Brooks, will never dare to change anything. She needs the dividends and stability more than we need the bank. She is too scared to rock the boat. I printed the page. The hum of the printer sounded like a war drum. I went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of black coffee. I returned to the desk and laid the documents out like a prosecutor preparing for a murder trial. Every interest rate, every late fee, every frantic transfer of funds between accounts to cover overdrafts, it was all there. It was an indictment written by the defendant himself. I took a yellow highlighter and slashed it across the terms and conditions of the original loan agreement. I found the clause I was looking for, Clause 4B, material change in guarantor status. It stated clearly that if the guaranteeing shareholder chose to restructure their own asset allocation, the bank had the right to demand immediate additional collateral or, failing that, to reduce the credit limit to 0 within 30 days. I remembered the night Arthur and I wrote that clause. We were sitting at this very desk, eating take-out Chinese food. Arthur had tapped the paper with his pen. Eleanor, he had said, we have to protect the bank from people who burn money just to save face. If they can't back it up with cash, we need a trapdoor. I never thought I would use that trapdoor to drop my son's future in-laws into a freefall. The plan formed in my mind with crystalline clarity. If I moved my guarantee, my shareholder protection, to a new trust fund for Daniel, the Pike family would be left exposed to the cold, hard wind of market reality. They would have to come up with $3 million in liquid assets overnight, or their credit cards would stop working. And based on the balance sheets in front of me, they did not have $3 million. They did not even have 3,000. I closed the thick folder and looked at the framed photograph of Arthur on the corner of the desk. He was smiling, that crooked, gentle smile that used to melt my heart. You always said you did not trust people who live on credit cards, I whispered to him in the quiet room. We are about to test that theory, aren't we? I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. But the glow of the computer screen lingered in my mind. The trap was set. Now. I just had to wait for them to walk into it. The following week, Savannah brought Daniel to my house for what she called a strategy session regarding their future. She sat on my floral sofa, looking around the living room with a critical eye that suggested she was measuring the square footage for a demolition crew. Eleanor, we need to have a serious conversation about the wedding, Savannah said, clasping her hands over her knee. The event needs to reflect the Pike family standing in the community. My parents are putting in so much, and, well, we feel the Brooks side needs to contribute to maintain the balance. For Daniel's dignity. She paused for effect, then dropped the hammer. My dad has arranged a guarantee for a penthouse in the new riverfront complex for us. It would be very easy if you sold this house. You could move into a smaller condo, maybe something with assisted living services nearby, and put the equity into our family fund. It is just asset reallocation. I looked at Daniel. He was staring at the floor, his face pale. He wanted to speak, but the weight of her expectation was crushing him. "Oh, my dear," I said, my voice trembling just enough to sound pathetic. "But the market is so unstable. And with my health, I need to keep my savings for medicine. You know how expensive hip surgeries are getting. I just don't know if I can afford to give up my security." Savannah sighed loudly, a sound of pure irritation. She turned to Daniel. "See, this is what I mean about hoarding resources. She's worried about hip surgery in 20 years while we are trying to build an empire now." 2 nights later, the pressure intensified at a dinner at the Pike estate. The main course was roast duck, but the side dish was guilt. Lydia Pike waited until the wine had been poured to launch her attack. "You know, Eleanor," Lydia said, slicing her meat with surgical precision. "My generation sacrificed a lot. My own mother-in-law sold her family farm to help Franklin start his first company. She lived in a trailer for 2 years. Do you not think you should learn to live a little less comfortably? Just a little. For the sake of the children." I took a sip of water to hide the cold fury rising in my throat. "I suppose everyone contributes in their own way," I murmured. Savannah leaned into Daniel, whispering loud enough for me to hear. "Honey, do not let your mother hold us back just because she is afraid of losing her creature comforts. It is selfish." I watched Daniel's hand under the table. He was gripping his napkin so tight his knuckles were white. He was angry, but he was too beaten down to know where to direct it. Franklin cleared his throat and slid a glossy brochure across the mahogany table toward me. It was for a new condotel project. "Look, Eleanor," Franklin boomed, "if you won't sell the house, at least be useful. I need a co-signer for this mezzanine loan. It is just a formality, a signature. Instead of letting your equity sleep in that old shack, you can sign here and help Daniel have a brighter share in the inheritance." I picked up the brochure, holding it upside down for a second before correcting myself, playing the part of the confused widow perfectly. "But, Franklin," I stammered, "this says high yield. Doesn't that mean high risk? What if? What if you go bankrupt? Would they take my house?" Franklin's face turned a shade of purple. He slammed his hand on the table. "Bankruptcy. Who talks about bankruptcy? We are Pikes. You are looking at a gold mine and asking about dust. She has to trust the family she is marrying into." "Daniel!" Lydia snapped, glaring at my son. "Make her understand." Later that night, Daniel walked me to my car. The heavy, humid air felt like a blanket. He stopped me before I opened the door. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "I am sorry. They shouldn't talk to you like that. I want to give her the life she wants. I feel so useless." I hugged him, feeling the tension in his frame. "It is okay, Daniel," I said softly. "I'm fine. Go back inside." I drove home with dry eyes. If they thought I was a wallet to be raided, I was about to show them what happens when the wallet snaps shut. I walked into my kitchen and cleared the table. I placed the thick file of the Pike family's disastrous credit report on the placemat. Right next to it, I placed the cream-colored card that had arrived in the mail that morning. Save the date. The wedding of Savannah Pike and Daniel Brooks. I stared at the 2 documents. One was a promise of a wedding. The other was a promise of a war. I tapped the credit report with my index finger. "Let's see how much they love you when the credit limit is 0. I whispered to the empty room. The next morning, I did not go to the bank's headquarters. Instead, I met Mariah Tate at a small, dimly lit coffee shop 3 blocks away from the financial district. Mariah is the current CEO of Viridian State Trust, a sharp woman in her late 40s whom my husband had mentored personally. She owed her career to Arthur, and she trusted my judgment more than she trusted the Federal Reserve. I slid a thick envelope across the scratched wooden table. I am activating the divestment clause. Mariah, I said, keeping my voice low, I am pulling my personal guarantee from the Pike Family Enterprises portfolio. Effective immediately. Mariah choked on her latte. She put the cup down, her eyes widening behind her glasses. Eleanor, are you sure the Pikes are loud? If we pull the rug out from under them, they will go to the press. They will say we are killing local business. It could be a PR nightmare. I smiled and pulled out the second document, the printout of Franklin's email, where he called me a cowardly old woman who existed solely to provide him with stability. Read this, I said. And then look at the risk assessment on page 4. They are leveraged at 98%. If the market dips even half a point, they are underwater. Keeping my guarantee in place is not supporting local business. Mariah, it is negligence. It is a breach of fiduciary duty. Mariah read the email. Her jaw tightened. She flipped to the risk assessment, her professional demeanor locking into place. He called you a cow, she whispered, half amused, half horrified. He called me a cash cow, I corrected. There is a difference. One gives milk, the other gets slaughtered. I am done being the latter. We called in our senior credit attorney, a man who enjoyed loopholes as much as I did. We spent the next 2 hours going over the fine print of the original loan agreement. Clause X was a thing of beauty. It stated clearly that if the primary guarantor withdrew their support, the bank had the right to demand additional tangible collateral to cover the exposure gap within 30 days. If the borrower failed to comply, the bank was authorized to freeze all revolving credit lines, corporate cards, and subsidiary accounts immediately to prevent asset flight. It is airtight, the attorney said, tapping his pen on the paper. Once you sign this, the clock starts. They have 30 days to find $3 million in hard assets. If they don't, the system locks them out. Do it, I said, but I don't want the capital sitting idle. Move my released funds into a new internal bond structure and direct the dividends into a new limited liability company. Call it Harborline Holdings. Harborline, Mariah asked, writing it down. Yes, I said, and put Daniel Brooks down as the sole director. He doesn't know it yet, but he is about to become the owner of the debt that is eating his fiancé's family alive. While Mariah handled the internal restructuring, I made a few phone calls to a broker in Atlanta. I spent the rest of the afternoon quietly purchasing secondary debt that the Pikes had scattered across 3 other smaller credit unions. It was cheap debt, considered high-risk junk by the market. But to me, it was leverage. By 3 in the afternoon, I was not just their banker, I was their shadow creditor. During the due diligence for the debt purchase, I found a detail that made me laugh out loud in the quiet of my car. It was a lien on a small property in Florida belonging to a Mrs. Beatrice Calloway, Lydia Pike's 80-year-old mother. Lydia had taken out a home equity line on her own mother's house, ostensibly for medical restructuring. A quick cross-reference with their credit card statements showed that the $50,000 drew down the exact same week the Pikes remodeled their kitchen and booked a 10-day trip to the Maldives. Moral high ground, I muttered, circling the transaction in red ink. You preach about sacrifice, while you mortgage your mother's roof for granite countertops. By 5 in the evening, the paperwork was done. The digital signatures were verified. The system at Viridian State Trust refreshed. My name was scrubbed from the guarantor field on the Pike accounts. The invisible umbrella that had kept them dry for a decade was gone. They were now standing alone in the rain, and they didn't even have a coat. I went home and opened a bottle of wine that cost $12. I sat at my kitchen table, the papers organized in neat stacks in front of me. The house was quiet, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a command center. I raised my glass to the empty room. To living less comfortably, I said, the wine tasting sweeter than any vintage Franklin Pike had ever bragged about. Congratulations, Franklin. You are finally a self-made man. Let's see if you can pay the bill. The week leading up to the wedding was not a celebration. It was a siege. My phone vibrated incessantly with notifications from the group chat Lydia had created. Every hour brought a new demand, disguised as a request. They needed more money for imported orchids. They needed a specific vintage of champagne for the toast. They needed me to pay for silk napkins that cost $40 apiece. It was a constant, buzzing reminder that to the Pikes, I was not a family member. I was a line item on a budget that was already spiraling out of control. On Tuesday, the tension finally snapped during a brunch meeting at the Pike estate. Lydia sat across from me at her kitchen island, scrolling through travel brochures on her tablet. "Eleanor," she said, not looking up. "We were looking at the honeymoon packages. The kids really deserve the grand tour of Europe. 3 weeks, Italy, France, Spain. It costs about $15,000. She looked up then, her eyes landing on my car keys sitting on the counter. "I noticed you hardly use that Subaru of yours. It is just sitting there in your driveway, depreciating. If you sold it, well, that would cover the flight upgrades and the hotels. It is a small sacrifice for their happiness. You should lead by example." I stared at her. That car was 10 years old, but it was reliable. It was my independence. That car is the only one I feel safe driving. "Lydia," I said calmly, "I cannot sell it." Lydia rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, exasperated breath. "God. Eleanor." She huffed. "If you just agreed to live, less comfortably, we would all breathe a lot easier." The room went silent. I saw movement in the doorway. Daniel was standing there. He had heard every word. He looked from his future mother-in-law to me, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and anger. That evening, Daniel came to my house. He sat at the kitchen table, wringing his hands. "Mom," he asked, his voice tight. Do you need cash? I can take out a personal loan. I don't want them to think you are stingy. I don't want them to treat you like a burden." I reached out and covered his hand with mine. "I am not holding out on you, Daniel," I said softly. "I have a wedding gift prepared for you. It is substantial. It is something neither of them could ever imagine." "Okay," he whispered, "as long as you're okay." He did not know that while he was worrying about my reputation. Franklin Pike was driving around town bragging about a $1 billion waterfront project to anyone who would listen. I had seen Franklin at the post office that morning. He was laughing, clapping people on the back, completely ignoring the certified letter from Viridian State Trust that I knew was sitting in his mailbox. That letter was a demand for $3 million in additional collateral, due by Friday, the Friday of his anniversary party. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on Thursday. I was dropping off a crate of handmade jam favors at the Pike's garage. The door to the mudroom was slightly ajar. I heard Lydia's voice, low and conspiratorial. "She is useless. Savannah," Lydia whispered. "But don't worry. Once the papers are signed on Saturday, we will start restructuring Daniel's accounts. We will slowly push the mother out of the financial picture. She won't even know it is happening until she is cut off." I stood frozen in the garage, clutching a jar of strawberry jam. A cold resolve settled in my chest. I could have walked in there and screamed. I could have warned Daniel right then. But he wouldn't have understood. He was too good, too trusting. He needed to see the monster without its makeup. He needed to watch them choose their money over his dignity. It was a cruel lesson. Perhaps the cruelest thing a mother could do. But I needed him to be free. The night before the 40th anniversary party, I stayed up past midnight. My house was silent, save for the rhythmic whirring of my printer. I prepared 2 folders. The first was thick, heavy with the weight of Franklin's lies, his inflated assets, and the bank's final demand. That was for the father. The second was thin, just a few pages, but it contained the truth that would shatter my son's heart to save his life. I walked to the hallway mirror. The woman staring back was 62 years old. She had grey hair and deep lines etched around her mouth. She looked like a grandmother. She looked like a victim. But then I looked closer at the eyes. There was no fear there. There was only the terrifying calm of a person holding a knife in a pitch-black room, waiting for the intruder to take one final step. The 40th wedding anniversary of Franklin and Lydia Pike was staged less like a celebration of love and more like a coronation. The ballroom of the Cypress Point Golf Club was packed with every local politician, real estate developer, and social climber in Savannah. A videographer circled the room, capturing forced smiles and the glint of rented jewelry for a commemorative video that would likely be posted online before the night was over. The master of ceremonies, a man with teeth so white they looked synthetic, boomed into the microphone. And here they are, the future of the Pike dynasty, the next generation of leadership, Savannah Pike and her fiancé, Daniel. There was no mention of the name Brooks. There was no mention of the bridge Daniel had designed last year that won a state award. He was just a prop, an accessory to their legacy. From my vantage point, the omission was glaring. I was seated at table 19, a small, wobbly table pushed up against a structural column near the swinging doors of the kitchen. I was surrounded by 3 of Lydia's elderly aunts, who spent the entire evening complaining about the air conditioning. At one point, a young server in a black vest actually stopped at my chair and tapped my shoulder. "Excuse me," he whispered. "Could you help me locate the extra napkins?" "Oh," I apologize. "I thought you were part of the event staff." I just smiled and shook my head. It was part of the theatre. After the speeches concluded and the applause died down, Lydia began her victory lap around the room. She moved from table to table, accepting compliments like tithes. Finally, she stopped in front of my exile near the kitchen. She looked flushed with wine and adoration. Savannah was right beside her, clutching a glass of champagne. Lydia looked down at me, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Well, Eleanor," she said, her voice loud enough to carry over the jazz music. "You look remarkably well preserved for a woman who refuses to sacrifice a single luxury. People like you really should learn to live less comfortably. You know, to help the young ones instead of clinging to that little old house." The conversation at the nearby tables died instantly. A few guests looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, but others smirked, sensing blood. Savannah did not defend me. She leaned into her mother, giggling, and covered her mouth with her hand. "Mom!" "Stop," Savannah said, though her eyes were cold and amused. "You are making her blush." Poor thing. She just doesn't understand how modern finance works. I saw Daniel then. He was standing 10 feet away, near the edge of the stage. He had been coming over to check on me, but he had frozen. He had heard every word. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sick. He looked at me, sitting there in my simple dress with my hands folded in my lap, trying to maintain a mask of polite confusion. Then he turned and looked at Savannah, his fiancée, who was currently laughing at his mother's humiliation. I felt his gaze on me. I knew I could step in. I could make a joke, diffuse the tension, and let the moment pass. But I did nothing. I let the silence hang there, heavy and suffocating. He needed to choose. Daniel walked past me. He did not go to Savannah. He walked straight up the stairs to the stage and took the microphone from the stand. The feedback whine made everyone jump. The room went silent. Daniel Lydia called out, her smile faltering. "Darling, speeches are over. My mother," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly before finding a terrifying steel core. "My mother has never asked you for a single dime. She lives in the house my father built. And you stand there. You stand there and tell her she is living too comfortably because she won't liquidate her life to fund ours, Daniel. You are drunk," Franklin shouted from the bar, laughing nervously. Daniel ignored him. He turned his gaze directly to Savannah, who was now standing alone in the center of the room, looking horrified not at the cruelty, but at the breach of social etiquette. "Savannah," Daniel said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I need to ask you something. Right now, if I lost everything tomorrow, if I had no inheritance, no penthouse, no ability to sign a loan for your father, would you still marry me? Or am I just a credit limit that you are trying to unlock?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath before a car crash. Every eye in the room shifted from Daniel to the girl in the white dress, waiting for an answer that wasn't coming fast enough. Lydia broke the silence first. She let out a laugh that sounded like glass breaking in a garbage disposal. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Daniel Lydia shrieked, waving her hand dismissively. "You have had too much to drink. He is just joking, everyone. Just a little. Pre-wedding jitters humor." The guests chuckled nervously, desperate to believe her. But the performance was interrupted by the arrival of the club manager. He was a discreet man in a dark suit, but he walked with a purpose that signaled bad news. He leaned in close to Franklin Pike, but in the sudden quiet of the room, his whisper carried like a shout. "Mr. Pike, I am afraid the card you provided for the remaining balance, it was declined." Franklin scoffed, his face flushing a deeper shade of red. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy black card, the corporate card for Pike Family Enterprises. "Don't be ridiculous," Franklin snapped. "There is a limit of $50,000 on this. Run it again." The manager shook his head slowly. "We did, sir. We also tried the subsidiary card on file. They both returned a do not honor code. I am sorry, but per club policy, we need a valid form of payment right now to continue the service." I took a sip of my water, watching the chaos unfold with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. The email I had sent earlier had finally propagated through the banking system. By withdrawing my personal guarantee, the risk algorithm had automatically recalculated the Pike family's creditworthiness. Without my assets shielding them, their debt-to-equity ratio had triggered an immediate freeze. Every credit line, every corporate card, and every overdraft protection linked to that account was now as useless as a plastic toy. Franklin's phone began to buzz on the table. Then it buzzed again, and again. He glanced at the screen, and I saw his eyes widen. It was his chief financial officer. Then a text from his project manager. Then an automated alert from the payroll system. The dominoes were falling. The transfers scheduled for tonight had bounced. The checks written yesterday were being returned. Before Franklin could even unlock his phone, a man in a polo shirt, the owner of the floral company supplying the weekend's events, pushed past a waiter and marched up to the head table. Franklin the florist shouted, ignoring the guests. "I just got an email from your bank saying the payment guarantee for the wedding flowers has been revoked. If I don't get $12,000 in cash tonight, my trucks are turning around. No payment? No orchids." Panic finally shattered the facade. Savannah grabbed Daniel by the arm, her fingernails digging into his tuxedo jacket. She pulled him toward the corner of the room, her voice rising in hysteria. "Daniel, do something," she hissed. "Fix this. Talk to your mother. My mom told me she has shares in the bank. She must have done something to the system." Daniel pulled his arm away, looking at her as if she were a stranger speaking a foreign language. "Shares?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. "My mother lives on a pension." "What are you talking about?" I stood up then. It was time. I walked over to where they were standing, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I reached into my purse and pulled out the thin envelope I had prepared for my son. "She is right about one thing, Daniel," I said calmly, handing him the envelope. "I do have shares, and I also have the ability to read a balance sheet." Daniel opened the envelope. He scanned the single page, a summary of the Pike family's massive debt, their reliance on my guarantee, and the letter confirming my withdrawal. His face went white, not with shame, but with the shock of sudden clarity. Franklin rushed over, sweat dripping down his forehead. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You vindictive witch!" Franklin screamed, his voice cracking. "You did this. You cut us off. You are betraying the family. You are ruining your own son's future." I looked him dead in the eye. "No. Franklin," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You were the one who was going to ruin him. You were tying my son to a sinking ship just so you could keep pretending to be a captain. I simply cut the rope." Franklin opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of the band packing up their instruments cut him off. The open bar had closed. The waiters were stripping the tablecloths from the empty tables. The guests were filing out in awkward silence, averting their eyes from the disaster. Lydia collapsed into a chair near the center of the empty dance floor. She looked around at the ruin of her perfect party, at the unserved cake, and at the husband who was frantically yelling into a dead phone. For the first time, she realized that living less comfortably was no longer a piece of advice she gave to others. It was her new address. The next morning, the sun glared off the blue glass facade of the Viridian State Trust headquarters in downtown Savannah. Franklin and Lydia Pike marched into the executive conference room at 9 o'clock sharp. They looked exhausted, their eyes puffy from a sleepless night. But they still wore their arrogance like armor. They carried briefcases and brought a lawyer. clearly expecting to bully a few junior loan officers into reinstating their credit limit. They stopped dead in the doorway. I was sitting at the head of the mahogany table. On my right sat Mariah Tate, the CEO. On my left sat Daniel. He was not wearing his usual flannel shirt and jeans. He was wearing a charcoal suit, and for the first time in his life, he did not look like a man apologizing for his existence. He looked like the director of Harborline Holdings, the bank's newest and most liquid corporate client. "What is this?" Franklin demanded, dropping his briefcase on an empty chair. "We are here to fix a clerical error, not to have a family reunion. Please sit down." "Mr. Pike," Mariah said, her voice cool and professional. "This is not a clerical error. Based on the immediate withdrawal of the shareholder guarantee, your risk profile has shifted to critical. We are requiring an immediate infusion of $3 million in tangible collateral to secure your outstanding positions. If you cannot provide this within 48 hours, we will move to liquidate the existing assets." Franklin slammed his hand on the table. "You can't do that. I will sue this bank into the ground. My family name is worth more than this entire building." I silently slid the second folder across the polished table. It stopped right in front of him. "Your name is not collateral, Franklin," I said softly. "And neither is fraud." He opened the folder. His face turned an ashen grey. Inside were the forensic accounting records I had compiled. They showed clearly that the business loans intended for capital improvements had been diverted to pay for the Maldives vacation, the new kitchen in Lydia's mother's house, and the deposit on a luxury car that was definitely not a construction vehicle. "I am not asking for the money back today," I continued, enunciating every word. "I am simply refusing to let you live on my signature any longer. The bank is enforcing the exact terms you signed 10 years ago. You played with the bank's money like it was a toy, and now playtime is over." Lydia realized that threats were useless. She switched tactics instantly, her eyes filling with practiced tears. She reached out across the table, trying to grab Daniel's hand, but he pulled it away. "Daniel, please." Lydia sobbed, her voice trembling. "We are family. Think of Savannah. Think of your future children. They need grandparents from both sides. You cannot let your mother destroy us. We just need a little time. I will always be there for Daniel," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "But I will never again allow anyone to use the word family as a weapon to drain my son dry." Daniel stood up. He looked down at the woman who had spent months making him feel small. "There won't be any grandchildren." "Lydia," Daniel said. "The wedding is off. I called the venue this morning. I cannot marry someone who sees my mother as an obstacle to be removed just so she can renovate a kitchen. I am done." A heavy silence filled the room. Franklin looked defeated, slumped in his chair. Mariah delivered the final blow. "Mr. Pike, if you are forced to liquidate assets to cover the call, you should know that Harborline Holdings has expressed interest in purchasing your distressed properties at a significant market discount." "Of course." Franklin looked up at Daniel, then at me. He realized the trap had snapped shut. The credit line he thought made him powerful was actually the leash I had been holding all along, and I had just yanked it tight. You want to buy my company," Franklin whispered. "Only the profitable parts," I replied. Franklin dropped his pen. "Take what you want," he muttered. "Just stop the bleeding." I stood up and gathered my files. The meeting was over. I looked at Lydia one last time. She was staring at her hands, stripped of her pretense, looking older than she ever had before. I will continue to live exactly as comfortably as I have earned, I told her. As for you, Lydia, it is time you learned how to live less comfortably without reaching into anyone else's pocket. I turned and walked out the door. The sound of the heavy latch clicking shut behind me, echoing like the final period on a sentence that had taken 40 years to write. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you folks are tuning in from. So please drop a comment down below and share your thoughts on whether you think Eleanor went too far or if the Pikes got exactly what they deserved. If you enjoyed this slice of drama, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help get this story out to more people. See you in the next one.